Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about a topic that is challenging security professionals all over the US, all over the world, and that is ransomware. We're going to attempt to answer that most difficult question. Is there a way to protect ourselves against ransomware? To discuss that, I'm joined by Simon Jelley, General Manager and Vice President of Product at Veritas Technologies. Simon, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the welcome, James. Great to be joining you.
And I know you've had maybe some challenges this week. You told me you were out. You were coaching rugby. You might have played a little rugby. We're glad that you're here. You've made it. You survived your rugby match.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the great news is that as things are returning more to normal, we're back out playing rugby again, which is fantastic. And
Nice.
unfortunately, I chose to get involved in a game with the San Jose State University guys that are coming back into campus for one of the first time. So
Okay.
I may be playing a little bit, trying to return to my youth. Mentally, I was always there and in the right position, maybe not physically all the time.
These guys are all 18, 19 years old, I'm assuming.
Exactly. And I'm obviously 21 again. Let's put it that way in terms of my age.
All right. Well, let's talk about a tough subject, ransomware. I would like to ask you, what is the current state of ransomware? And I'm hoping the answer is, oh, it's really exploded over the last year, but companies are waking up and they're taking a lot of steps, and we almost have it beat. Uh, Maybe it's too optimistic. What is the current state of ransomware as you see it?
Yeah, I think unfortunately that's not quite the state. I wish like you it were true. And I think the reality is I would say two things about ransomware in particular. One, it is a business model that's maturing its routes to market, right? Number one.
Yeah.
So that makes it harder for organizations to catch up. And then, secondarily, it's one where that part of maturing the routes to market is about unfortunately the ransomware attackers are trying to, like they do in any market, let's find the most target rich environments for us to go after. Where can we get the most value to that? So let me
Right.
put that in concrete terms, right? So from
Sure.
a routes to market perspective, I think one evolution we've seen is this move beyond targeting individual organizations to targeting the supply chain of data to those organizations, right? Attacks
Ah,
to MSPs, for example, right? We saw the Kaseya attack as widespread kind of publicized news, right? So it's that multiple attack vector in terms of being able to get to impact organizations and their lifeblood. I think
is that more of a recent phenomenon, or is that been going on a while? That the supply chain attack.
well, I think that's something that's certainly evolved over the last 6 to 9 months, in terms of the attack itself. I
Mm-hmm.
think secondarily, we've seen evidence of in the market that it's not just the ransomware attackers that are perpetrating their attacks. They're now recognizing, look, our expertise in terms of providing the exploitation code is in developing that code, but we may not be the experts in terms of how to then leverage that in the best way to get access into a company's network or into their most important assets. Let's outsource that, right? So it's like a business that's building out its supply chain itself. That was certainly true in some of the evidence around BitLocker and other pieces. It wasn't them that was actually perpetrating the attack into organizations. So I think that's where the maturity in terms of that supply chain is where maturing its routes to market is going. I think the second piece is we've seen more and more evidence of ransomware is widespread. It's across every industry,
Right.
but the evolution is much more towards enterprise organizations, right?
Mm.
If you look kind of 12 to 18 months ago, it's much more prevalent in non-profit, government, public sector, which I think,
Oh,
again, the argument was ransomware attackers saw those as maybe the easier targets in terms of
right.
was infrastructure most up to date.
Right.
But now I'm seeing much more, most recently, obviously, with the Accenture publicized attack, much more into those enterprise organizations. So again, I view that as much like any market does. They're trying to figure where is the most value for us, right? Because ultimately their lifeblood is getting the payment for the ransoms. Now, let's take the more optimistic view. I
Sure.
think the good news is the Accenture attack is an example of the good news is people were proactively ready to respond there and they were able to recover their data. So I
Uh-huh.
think there's definitely evidence of people are now getting ahead of the curve in terms of making sure that they can recover and not have to pay the ransom, which is ultimately what we have to do to turn off the lifeblood of supply of that ransomware dollars to
Hmm.
those that are trying to obviously perpetuate those attacks moving forwards.
So really, the ransomware bad guys saw some of those low hanging fruit in the security or in the public sector. But now they also see that the more lucrative enterprise targets, which of course are going to be better protected. So, but they're still willing to go after, in the case of Accenture, those better protected targets.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's an interesting space, right? Because you're meeting that evolution. Ransomware is in that perfect evolution of digital transformation, where more and more companies are dependent on data is their infrastructure, right? There's always been attacks on organizations at their most valuable assets, which is their infrastructure in any industry.
Right.
Meet the evolution of social engineering, right? I mean, I think that's what makes it most difficult for this to be just blocked from a security perspective, and why we're very focused on the attack is going to happen. You make sure you can actually recover, as opposed to having to pay those ransoms.
So, obviously, almost all enterprises have security software, in most cases, a pretty robust security software infrastructure in place.
Mhm.
Why does that alone keep falling short? You think that would block everything, would it not?
Yeah. So again, I think, as I said, I think it's difficult, because I think security vendors are trying to, you talk a lot of the trend is around this kind of zero trust and
Right.
trust the kind of infrastructure for security as the latest buzz, as it were, or latest technology trend in terms of trying to help. And I think the security vendors are certainly trying in terms of mitigating against the risks of ransomware. The reality is, again, back to, they are struggling because it's a difficult evolution. It's a very lucrative billions of dollar business, and they're playing catch up to what's the next signature. I mean, that's always frankly been the case in the antivirus kind of market as a pre-evolution to this.
Right.
And again, I think what makes it the next evolution is you are in that center point of digital transformation and social engineering, that makes it, you're not just dealing with data in terms of accidental deletion or attack vectors, but now it could be maliciously done by your own employees, right? Whether accidentally or not, in terms of letting that ransomware threat in, which makes it an even harder vector to protect against.
And I think a lot of companies feel the pressure, and they get, hit by a ransomware, and we've seen instances where the companies do actually pay it, in some cases, some pretty vast sums.
Mm.
But you're of the opinion that a company should never pay ransomware. It's just never the right thing to do. Why do you feel that way?
No, absolutely not. They shouldn't pay. And I think there's a couple of reasons. One, evidence supports, there's multiple studies. I read one this morning that suggested that organizations that have paid, only about 8% of their actual data do they truly get back and fully recovered. So
Really?
one, there isn't evidence, there's no evidence that you're going to get your data back even if you pay, right? Number
Right.
one.
Right.
Number two, I think, if you take that strategy, there's still the downtime period before you pay the ransom and are able to fully recover that data. So, and downtime can be massive costs in terms to the organization on a per hour basis. I
Right.
think one study we did looking at enterprise organizations across the world, ransomware is costing about 2.3 million per hour in terms of downtime costs overall. To put it in
Wow.
real world figures, it's massive, right? So,
Mm.
but I think there's then a more, moral based kind of viewpoint, which is paying the ransoms is the lifeblood of keeping ransomware going, right? Back to your
Right.
very first question, how do we eventually stop this?
Right.
I think he's showing, look, it's not a viable business model for you to continue to pursue. Go spend your smart efforts on other more industrious enterprises ultimately.
Right. Well, so if we give some practical advice, how do organizations prepare for a ransomware attack in such a way they can avoid paying the ransom? What is sort of the trick to get ahead of the curve?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things four things I would say in terms of looking at kind of how to prepare for ransomware attacks. And so number
Yeah.
one, making sure that you've got consistent policies in place in terms of being able to protect your infrastructure and your data. I think one of the things we've traditionally seen, coming as an expert for 30 plus years in this particular space as Veritas, is customers typically have kind of a blanket policy as to how they protect and manage their data. And now with the value of data, I think the key is to get much more prescriptive in terms of looking at what are your most important assets and data, and are you putting the right protection policies in place, and protection policies that reflect, how quickly do you need to get that data back, how accessible, not all data is equal essentially, right, in
Right.
terms of doing that. So I think truly doing the right kind of audit. of the data and putting the right policies, both from a protection, but also more importantly from a how do you need to use that data would be a first step.
Okay.
Secondarily, you need to have infrastructure in place in terms of your backup data management that is truly hardened, right? Immutable, it's storage in terms of being out how you actually store and protect that data, backup infrastructure that's ransomware resilient. And I think one of that backup infrastructure connects back to the policy point in that we also see customers with multiple different types of data policy engines, or for example, multiple backup solutions. Well, that becomes harder. Do you how to put those consistent policies in place if you've got multiple sources that are ultimately managing the data? So getting that, ensuring you've got a truly ransomware resilient infrastructure with those policies in place. Third,
is that I'm sorry, one question about that. In other words, if a company has, and of course companies do have multiple backups because they tend to have a very fractured data infrastructure in reality. It's not ideal, but that's the sort of the
reality
put together with duct tape. So you're saying is your tip there to make sure you really have one single backup for everything, or can companies still deal with having multiple backups and different for different divisions?
Yeah, so I think ideally it's more what's your policy. Ideally, the most pragmatic advice we would give is, do you have a consistency of understanding how the policies across those engines are, right? That's the first step, right? There are ways you can put consistent policy engines with our Veritas solutions that work across those backup estates. Being more looking at the future iteration, yes, our recommendation is how do you ultimately consolidate the number of infrastructures you're relying on, because it isn't manageable longer term in our view in terms of having that kind of fractured infrastructure.
Right. All right. Yeah, I think you run to point number 3 if I remember.
So point number 3 or 4. So number 3 is making sure that you're implementing what we call a 3-2-1 strategy, right? That's typically become kind of the best practice advice. Right? You've got 3 copies of the data, 2 of which are located online or nearline for day-to-day business productivity, but a 1 copy that's truly out of the bands of being an attack vector, right? It's not in that attack surface. It's protected on immutable storage. We're actually seeing a resurgence in terms of customers even looking at tape to provide that ultra safe copy away from the network, which is interesting evolution. But also, we work, for example, with the cloud providers that are looking to build immutable storage into their cloud storage and make that very easy for customers to implement that strategy. And then the 4th, which I think all of the others before, customers are starting to embrace in different ways. I think the 4th area that isn't as much yet, and I expect to evolve, is making sure you truly can test and rehearse your policies and particular recovery processes, right? I think often we find with our customers, they have a great policy in place, but when was the last time they actually tested those recovery procedures? Tends to be something that isn't rehearsed on a regular basis.
Right. That's obviously essential. And then your earlier point about tape is so interesting in that, tape is seen as slower. Some people really like it because they say it's hyper cheap. But you're saying that there's the advantage of tape is that you physically have that tape in your hand, so to speak. Yeah. So there's something, I guess, in this ideal world in which all the enterprise's data was on tape, which might not work, but if it was all on tape, they could just say to the ransomware person, sorry, we've got all our data in house. There's not much you can do. Would that be kind of an odd answer to the whole thing?
I think it's an interesting evolution we've seen. Again, what tape always provided was that it's offline from all that infrastructure, right? And it did provide that ultimate safe copy. So we've certainly, I know there was one of our competitive vendors in the past that said, tape is dead. I think we're far from that truth in terms of the reality. And it's, one of the reasons I love being in the backup recovery space is it's that classic space of you're constantly leading and disrupting yourself in the evolution. And I think tape is doing itself. It's interesting to see that kind of resurgence in this. How do you provide that ultimate safe copy of the data?
So I want to give you a chance to talk about how Veritas in particular can play a role. I guess my real answer, my question before we get to that is there a fix for ransomware? And you've just talked about it with your 4 points. Really is probably the best way to prepare. But if you look ahead, are we gonna, if we get to 2025 or 2027, are we gonna say to ourselves, gosh, remember those bad ransomware years? We really figured that one out. Are we gonna be able to leave ransomware behind us?
I wish I could hand on heart be optimistic and say absolutely yes. I honestly believe the more that we put these policies in place to act with the philosophy of it's not if you're going to attack, it's when, and that the organizations therefore put it in their own control to recover their own data. They're not relying on paying the ransomware. That will
Right.
go a long way in terms of, essentially stopping the ransomware vendors or attackers getting paid, and ultimately, we stop fueling their fire essentially. Whether that truly brings an end by what date, that's a difficult thing to say, but I think the key advice is making sure we act as though the recovery has to be in the control of our own organization, not in the hands of essentially a criminal organization.
Right. Well, let's talk about how can Veritas play a role in this. So let me give you a chance to talk about your own role.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's obviously been an area that we've been investing in for many years in terms of helping customers. 16 years a leader in the Gartner Magic Quadrant from an enterprise data protection perspective, and from a ransomware perspective, we're very pleased to say that we've helped 100% of the organizations that have had ransomware attacks so far. We've been able to help them recover with our Veritas technologies, particularly across our net backup enterprise data protection portfolio, and with Backup Exec serving that SMB customer space. I think there's 5 points I'd hit in terms of key things that we do and offer customers. Number one, we offer the broadest form of protection out there in the market. With our 16 years of market leadership, 30 plus years in the space, we protect 800 plus applications and data landscapes out there. And I think one of the interesting, we talked about that ransomware vendors often going after the easy targets. What they tend to target is those more traditional infrastructures that NetBackup has a rich heritage in terms of being able to protect and provide the protection of, as well as obviously we've added the ability to protect over 200 plus clouds, SaaS applications now that we're protecting overall. So again, we can provide that single platform, that single protection across our applications. And also we provide that with a very sophisticated policy engine. So again, in terms of being able to make sure that you're protecting with the right level of recovery the most important data, that's something that's inbuilt into what we offer within our solutions. Thirdly, ransomware resiliency is built into the Net Backup and Backup Exec platform. We include that's integrated with our latest FlexScale appliance that includes data immutability built into the storage layer. And we also uniquely work with the cloud providers who are building immutability into their storage layers. So it's not just what we're doing in our own, leading in terms of our own software and our own solutions, but also in our partnerships with key other parts of that backup infrastructure itself. And then again, the last couple of points I made around implementing a 3-2-1 policy and being able to drive recovery rehearsals, those are things that are very easily built into Net Backup and also Backup Exec. So again, 3-2-1 is an easy policy you can implement with our appliances or directly out to any third-party storage, any cloud, any tape in terms of driving that safety copy of the data. And then we've got built into our solutions the ability to do those test drives and regular recovery rehearsals themselves as well.
Interesting. Okay. That's pretty the full story. Let me educate myself just a bit more about the ransomware thing, in that getting back to the tape idea. In other words, if a company had all their data offline, then in fact it would be safe from a ransomware attacker, correct?
In theory, absolutely, yes.
Because it's only because today's world, all the data is, at least it has to be online. Otherwise, how are we moving to run the system? So in this utopian world where we could have an entire copy of our data offline, then that company would be safe, correct? But I guess the problem is it's not financially feasible to have the entire company's data offline at all times, because even a copy of it, because it's just too vast. Is that part of the problem?
That is part of it. Exactly. I think, how quickly you can recover the business. This is why we talk about, I think we first introduced this term as Veritas, but it's widely adopted, this 3-2-1 backup policy technique. Ultimately, that you can still have two copies of the data that are nearline, whether it be, for example, on a cloud storage, and we certainly embrace making that cloud storage, base it on some form of immutable storage. But that third copy being on a completely offline media gives you those different tiers of recovery, right? So if things do extend to your secondary nearline on location is actually impacted in terms of the vulnerability, you've ultimately got a backstop in terms of that recovery with tape itself. So it's trying to blend the threat vector and how do you protect against it. There is more focus of the ransomware vendors getting into your backup infrastructure overall, with the balance of you ultimately have a safe copy and don't have to pay that ransom itself.
And the problem with having all the data in the safe copy is that, an insurance company, a finance company, whatever, is simply moving too fast to have 95% of their data, a copy of their data offline. Is it just almost physically impossible?
Exactly. And that's why for those, 2 nearline or online copies, obviously we've invested in and built immutable storage into our own appliances that you can run as a true end-to-end stack with your backup software. Or again, we've integrated with the cloud providers providing that. But again, you've still got that ultimate safe copy back out to tape or your offline copy if those become an issue in terms of the threat vector itself.
All right, I'll just because I'm a slow learner, I'll just ask you one more question or so. Then because I think I really understand it. So, if some company said, "Oh no, we're going to spend whatever it takes to protect ourselves from ransomware," they really could protect 100% of their data and keep it offline, keep a copy offline.
Right.
Is that even within the realm of possibilities? Like, no, they just physically.
Yeah, they absolutely could. In terms of you've got the data protected, obviously you've got to weigh that against how feasible that is from a recovery time objective perspective, right?
Yeah. Right. Okay. I appreciate you walking me through that, because it's a vexing problem, and it's like,
yeah,
I see now why it is virtually impossible to make it go all the way away. The problem is we live in a very fast moving world and a very connected world.
Absolutely.
If we kept all our records in paper notebooks in our desk, there would be no problem with ransomware.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's very true. Very true.
Of course, the world moves just a little bit faster than that. That's the problem with that.
Right, exactly. The business is reliant on that data to move quickly. Absolutely.
Right. Simon, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I learned a lot. You educated me. Thank you. And I appreciate it.
Thank you, James. Very good to talk to you. I appreciate the time today.